Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Nolan Brown, a staff editor at Reason Magazine.
And we've got lots to talk about today, Liz. Let's start by talking about police unions, because I just wrote this story about a police union in Santa Ana, California. And the backstory is kind of crazy. There are a bunch of marijuana dispensaries in Santa Ana. And they've kind of focused there because Santa Ana had the most lax regulation among surrounding cities. And so all of these marijuana dispensaries are operating there under kind of unclear legality. They don't have a business permit technically, but the city's not really going after them either. And then the city decides to start cracking down. And so what this would really require is just getting warrants and going around to these businesses and verifying that, yes, they are working without a proper business permit. And then you could do all kinds of things. You could seize their products. You could put a padlock on the front door. You could see if they listen to a court order in a way that they haven't listened to just kind of verbal warnings. Instead, the Santa Ana Police Department decided to do a daytime raid of one of these pot dispensaries. And so customers are just kind of milling around what's basically a storefront business. And police come with like a battering ram and start busting down the door. It seems like in the video that we have that at some point they figured out that the door was just open. You could just walk through it because, you know, like the customers clearly didn't have a battering ram to get in. And so
That's standard pot shop procedure.
So at some point they come through the door. They've got guns drawn. A couple of them are wearing masks, and everyone in the store is understandably, at first they're terrified, and then they see at least it's police officers and not, robbers taking down the store. But still, they're alarmed, and they lay down on the floor, and the police come around and get everybody out. So, to me, this alone is pretty discrediting to the Santa Ana Police Department. They have their guns out. They're needlessly endangering these people. They could have done this in a lot of different ways that didn't use all of this unnecessary force. But this is only the backstory. At this point, you see on one of the surveillance cameras, the cops are going around taking down all the surveillance cameras around the store. And it's kind of surreal because you're watching on this one camera that apparently they don't see. And so they're using a crowbar to pry these surveillance cameras off the walls, and eventually they think that they've gotten them all. And at that point, the police officers who were apparently undercover, who had masks on, take off their masks, and they start kind of...
Why were they wearing masks to fool pot shop owners?
Yeah, I think that they were undercover narcotics officers. And again, why do they have to go on this raid? Really, you only needed, one police officer to go on this raid. You could have sent the unarmed person who gives traffic tickets to do this raid, and nothing bad would have happened. But in any case, I guess the reasoning is that maybe they send these people in to do undercover buys at these businesses that are operating without a permit in order to verify that they're actually selling or something like that.
Right.
And you don't want all the pot shop owners to know who these... I mean, it's not really like the highest stakes undercover operation in the world again. But so they take off their masks, and then the police officers start joking around with one another. And there's a woman in a wheelchair in the shop when it got raided. And one police officer says to another something to the effect of, "Did you punch that old woman in the wheelchair?" And she had a leg amputated. And the other said, "Yeah, I was going to punch her in her fucking nub." So it's just basically, you can't think of something in poorer taste for them to say being captured on this video recording. And then they began to egg each other on to start eating the pot products. And all of the newspaper accounts say it appears that they were eating pot products. They're unwrapping things.
Yeah, I've seen that part of the story. I hadn't heard about the wheelchair thing, but...
And the audio is yeah, I'm starting to get dizzy right now. I mean, it's pretty obvious what's going on if you watch the video. So this is actually still part of the backstory because this comes out in the press, and everyone is predictably outraged, and the OC Weekly, the alternative newspaper, is having a field day with it. The Orange County Register is writing about it, and so this happens in May, and you would think in a sane system that these officers would be disciplined in something like a timely manner. In fact, they've been on leave, and all this time later, all these months later, apparently the internal affairs investigators still haven't done their jobs here because the police union in Santa Ana has just filed a lawsuit where three of the police officers on this video and the police union are suing to prevent internal affairs from using this public video to discipline these police officers. And their theory is that they had a reasonable expectation of privacy, and that California is a state where you have to tell people you're being recorded, and no one told them they were being recorded. So they take out the business owner at gunpoint, and then they complain when they're in the business owner's store prying off their surveillance cameras that they didn't warn them they were being recorded, which they couldn't possibly know that they had tried to pry off the surveillance cameras because they've taken them out at gunpoint. And they say that they shouldn't be an internal affairs investigation because without what they characterize as this illegal video, there would be no investigation, right? And what I find amazing about that is implicit in their formulation is that like the half dozen cops or more who are at this raid are all going to cover for each other's misbehavior. So there's going to be no account of it. Like this is assumed in the argument that they're making, even though they don't lay it out explicitly. It's assumed that all of these cops are going to cover for one another. So fortunately, this isn't one of those police stories where someone lost their life or even got, beat up and put in the hospital by the police. At the same time, it's a pretty...
But
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, but I think that part of the reason why those stories can happen where people, get beat up and killed by police and are unaccountable is because of this union system that you're talking about. That's evident in this story, too. So the same underlying root of that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and the union, it's an illustration of the union trying to suppress evidence and doing so. There's evidence of this misbehavior that other police officers, internal affairs officers, are hoping to use in an investigation into behavior I think is criminal, unless, I doubt that all of the police officers had their medical marijuana cards. And so, you're talking about potentially criminal behavior, and here's the police union trying to prevent police officers from using evidence of criminality in a case. And so, to me, it's just so discrediting to this police union. And I actually wish that the Black Lives Matter movement would focus a little bit more on injecting police unions into the left side of this spectrum. Because I've seen a lot of libertarians and some conservatives take issue with police unions. It's the one part of the police reform puzzle that I think is really important that's missing among a lot of the people on the left who are focusing on this issue.
Yeah, I know. My colleague at Reason, Ed Krajewski, he writes a lot about police union issues, and that's been kind of what you just said has been one of the things he's been saying too. Because this story is like every part you tell, it just gets more and more horrible and shocking. But then shocking maybe isn't the right word though, because it's just like, that kind of figures. Like when you read these stories, and I guess I read them a lot because Ed shares them a lot. When you read these stories, and he finds these all over the country, it's just like again and again you see police unions defending the worst sort of behavior, even when it's like very apparent that it is happening, even when it's caught on tape. There was one where like they caught these two the dashboard cam somehow got released because I think there had been something that happened, so they ended up releasing it. But it caught cops joking beforehand, and like a woman walked by and they were joking about her getting raped, and then they were like, go ahead and call the cops. What are we going to do? I don't know. It was terrible. And then, of course they were like, well, we shouldn't, this shouldn't have gotten out, this dash cam video, instead of saying, wow, that's despicable that our cops are joking about not helping rape victims.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So.
But I don't know why it's not as much of an issue on the left. I think there's so many parts. I don't think that they're opposed. Do you get that sense that people on the left are opposed to talking about police unions, or just that it's sort of something that hasn't really caught on yet?
I think it's a very uncomfortable subject because labor unions and the left, there's this idea of
Oh, yeah.
solidarity across labor unions, right? And so,
Right.
this labor union is going to help that labor union if one's on strike. And it, it it's uncomfortable because of the ideal of solidarity on the left. It's also uncomfortable because it fits into this larger discussion about public employee unions generally, which the right is
Right.
generally antagonistic to, and the left is generally supportive of. So, uh, how does it play into the debate about teachers' unions, for example, if there's this sustained attack on a different public employees union? Um, to me, it just seems straightforwardly so that whatever the left decides to do um, on teachers' unions or any other kind of unions, they should draw a distinction when it comes to police unions and prison guard unions. To me, these two
Right.
entities are just um, first, just empirically speaking, I think that they are much more pernicious and have much worse real world outcomes um, for um, for the realms in which they lobby and craft legislation. Um, and they're also the two public employee unions that have these people who have no constituency of their own. Criminal defendants and people who are in jail. People who are in jail don't even have the vote, and criminal defense. It's not like they have even teachers unions in bad schools where people argue there's no one representing the kids. At least they have parents and
Right.
they're sympathetic characters, right? And so I really think there is a difference with prison guard unions and police unions that and I think it's a huge obstacle to reform. I mean, you see some of these shooting cases. I don't know if you saw that case in where was it in Cincinnati, where the
Yeah. Yeah.
where University of Cincinnati police officer shot and killed a guy, and he's being charged with murder. And in the press conference given by the prosecutor, which I think was one of the better press conferences I've ever seen a prosecutor give, he was expressing his shock and outrage at what this police officer did and the video evidence against him. And he expressed surprise at something he didn't know, even as a prosecutor, that the police union at the University of Cincinnati, he said that the union contract specifies that after a shooting, um, the police officer doesn't have to give a statement about what happened for 2 days.
Right.
They have 48 hours to think it over. And this is not uncommon. I don't know that it exists everywhere, but it definitely does exist in other jurisdictions. And it's just an example of this an absurd instance of a double standard you're setting up between the way that everyone else is treated after shooting someone and the way that police are treated after shooting someone. And it doesn't take very much imagination to realize that a police officer who is wrongfully killing people would benefit tremendously from having 48 hours to even give a statement to get their story straight instead of having investigators question them as quickly as possible as you would with any other killing.
Yeah, and it's strange because that's the kind of thing too. I mean, that kind of reform, that kind of simple thing, like not letting them have that time period, has nothing to do with a lot of the labor union issues that people on the left might be opposed to. So it's kind of like, yeah, if they would just address this, then they'd probably see that there are all these things that that they could be working on this front. But
Yeah, it's related only in the sense that when these police unions are negotiating their contracts, when any public employee union is negotiating their contract, it's not like a profit-driven enterprise negotiating with a labor union where there's someone
right,
with skin in the game on both sides, and so there's um, at least some guarantee that all of the issues relevant to the outcome are going to get hashed out for better. Not to say that it always comes out the right way, but um, with police unions, you have um, an entity that is sometimes very popular among a certain demographic in cities, often those in political power, and they're negotiating against a city council that they give money to every time that a campaign comes around, and the people on the city council don't really have a particular uh, stake in how long it takes to negotiate to interrogate a police officer after a shooting. And if anything, they have a perverse incentive to give the cops more time because, as representatives of the city, they're going to get sued if it's a wrongful shooting. It's going to cost the city money, so the incentives just don't align the same way. Um, so, why don't we move along to a topic that you've been writing about, this Amnesty International report about sex work. Why don't you introduce it for us?
Yeah, Amnesty International, which is the big international sort of humanitarian and civil rights, human rights group, just put out a draft policy on sex work, and they basically are calling for the decriminalization of prostitution, not just in the sort of what's known as the Swedish model, which is really popular right now, which is where it is not technically illegal to sell sex, at least under certain circumstances, but it is illegal to buy sex, to be a client of a sex worker. So that's they're not calling for that too. They explicitly say that they don't want that. They want total decrim, and they think that that is best for the health and safety of everybody. People who are choosing to do sex work, people who may be forced into it. They think that that's better for everybody. So they put out this policy. It's just a draft policy, but they're presenting it this week, and it attracted a huge backlash, which probably wouldn't be getting very much attention because it was just a bunch of women's groups protesting and religious groups, but they got a whole lot of celebrities to sign on. So Lena Dunham and Meryl Streep and Lisa Kudrow and Carey Mulligan and a whole bunch of pretty Anne Hathaway, famous Hollywood celebrities, have signed on to this letter, saying that they couldn't believe what Amnesty was doing, and it was a form of gender apartheid was the phrase they use. That if we did this, it would be committing gender apartheid. So
the assumption being that only men are going to be buying sex work and only women are going to be providing it, and so is that the logic?
Yeah. And then they said it would create, this sex class and all this stuff. But that then has sparked another backlash from the sex work community broadly, who have been, asking why nobody talked to any of them about what they wanted and didn't include their opinions on it. And a lot of these celebrities who signed this letter are celebrities who, publicly talk about feminism and the need for feminism and consider themselves feminists. And so, it's kind of a bit of hypocrisy here, I think, or at least a lot of people have been saying that.
Yeah, I think one thing that interests me about this debate is the way in which the illegality of sex work prevents a lot of sex workers from speaking publicly about this, as well as the stigma against sex work. And so this class of laborers that's pretty large is just, I feel like the stereotype is that they're all sort of people to be pitied who are pushed into this and coerced into it against their will. And I think that if every sex worker were able to speak publicly about their opinion, that stereotype would quickly become very complicated. And
yeah, well, that's part of the problem. I mean, that was kind of cool is that with the rise of the internet and especially Twitter and stuff, I mean, that sex workers themselves do have a lot more visibility. They're not just relying on journalists to tell their story who often sensationalize it. They're actually out there speaking for themselves, and people can go directly to the source and hear them. And there's actually like a wonderful, large, supportive sex work community on Twitter. So that's really great. And I think that more than ever before is really helping to break down some myths. Mm-hmm. But then you see that get dismissed just out of hand by anyone. If you point that out, people will say, well, they're not representative because, they have Twitter. So clearly, like, sex workers on Twitter can't be representative sex workers, which right. It might not be all of them. But I mean, there's a large group of people, like they clearly exist. So
right. And I also, maybe you know this, I don't. Do you know how legal sex workers, for lack of a better term, feel about this? And I don't mean the few people who are in a legal brothel in Nevada, but I mean the larger sex industry, meaning people who are doing, regulated porn films, who are doing, even dancing at strip clubs. Like, have they weighed in on this question of sex work that is now illegal?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know at large, but I also, because I write about sex work is, a broad term, and I write about it broadly. So I follow a lot of people who are in porn and dominatrixes and all sorts of things on Twitter and other social media, and I interact with them other ways. So From the ones I know, yes, everybody is in favor of prostitution decriminalization. Everybody has been speaking out against the celebrities and for amnesty. Conor Habib, who's a famous porn star and activist, has been really on this, criticizing. Actually, not criticizing. He's been really nice. He's been asking Lena Dunham them to please reconsider their position and listen to the many sex workers who are speaking out about this. But yeah, I get the general sense that because the criminalization of prostitution makes a lot of all sex work more difficult, because they get more harassment from police or all sorts of things, because they'll be like, well, maybe it's a front for prostitution. So it just sort of ends up leading to more regulation of all sorts of sex work, even the kind that is legal.
Right. So what about this trend toward changing the punishment from punishing the sex workers to punishing Johns? This is a trend you've noted in your writing. What do you think about that?
It's one of those things that gets a lot of people's support because it sounds kind of, well, I guess not necessarily punishing Johns sounds good to everybody, but a lot of people think okay, yes, punish them and we'll stop it. Or there are even some people who are like, well, clearly we have to have penalties against people who are helping aid sex workers. Maybe we won't punish people who are selling it. Maybe we won't punish people who are buying it. But if someone is, managing a sex worker or as a madam at an escort service or something, then, they're legally considered a sex trafficker, even if they're not using force in a lot of countries. Mm-hmm. So it kind of sounds good. You're like, yeah, we're just holding the Johns and the sex traffickers accountable. But what you see in actuality in countries like Sweden, where these laws have taken place, or even when they've kind of in the United States, when different cities have been like, we're going to go after this and not go after sex workers themselves.
Right.
What you see is that they still end up arresting sex workers themselves all the time. Because usually it's, there's been cases recently in the United States where there's been 17-year-olds who drive another 17-year-old sex worker to a job, and one of them gets charged as a trafficker. Right. Or, someone is managing an escort service and they get charged as a sex trafficker because they are aiding with that. So it sounds really good, but it still ends up being used to criminalize sex workers themselves more than bad guys. So... And I don't think that people should be punished for buying or selling sex, just, on principle. But
well, yeah, I was going to say, I think that if this trend of punishing Johns continues, I mean, there is part of me that thinks, well, it's for whatever reason, my knee-jerk reaction without having really looked into it is I want it to be legal and regulated, but that seems like a slight improvement over the status quo. I don't know. I'd have to think more about it to know if I would really think that. But I do think that if Johns are criminalized and start to be arrested in larger numbers, there's going to be a lot of sympathetic John cases that come out, just as there are a lot of sympathetic prostitute arrests that come out.
Yeah.
I think that there's again,
you have people, DC has really been cracking down on Johns, and they just, they've been bragging that there was a 2-week period in July where they arrested 50, and there was a cop quoted about how the penalties were really severe, and these men were going to be embarrassed if they had families, and it's just DC, we've had more murders this summer than we have, I don't know, there's just been so many murders this summer already. It's not that that's a false equivalence, probably not the same cops, but it just seems like there are so many crimes in DC, so much is going unsolved, and they're bragging about how they're ruining men's lives for offering to pay for sex. So
yeah,
it's a waste of resources. And also the thing is that, as someone has pointed out, I forget who, but they're saying that when you up the penalties for Johns, so in a lot of these places with the Swedish model, it's a felony to try and patronize prostitution. When you up the penalties, the kind of men who are willing to risk a felony to do that are kind of different as a whole than the class of men who might go if it's not so criminalized. So you end up sort of with a different, people say that it ends up making, more dangerous clientele for sex workers too.
What about the experience of countries that have just gone ahead and legalized prostitution? How has it worked out for them?
There's not a lot, but New Zealand has, I think since 2002. And by all accounts, it's going really well. They said they have not seen either an increase in either street-based prostitution, which, can be kind of like people complain about that being a nuisance. So that was one of the things people were worried about. They haven't seen an increase in that. People will say if you legalize prostitution, then you'll have an increase in sex trafficking. They haven't seen that. And there is some indication that that condom use, they've done surveys that condom use is up, because a lot of places still, you can use, if cops catch you with condoms, that can be used as evidence against you in a prostitution case. So, so just across the board, they've seen, yeah. New York just ended it last year. And there are other cities in the United States where that's still a thing.
So I don't understand. Why? Can you explain? Maybe this is a dumb question, but lots of people use condoms who are not sex workers. Why is this evidence of sex work, particularly?
Right. Well, so if a police officer stopped you on the street randomly and checked your pockets for condoms, he probably wouldn't arrest you for if you had 3 or more. But in New York, it was the case that, if, it was kind of one of those things that was written in the law where it was one of the factors that police could use or judges could use in determining whether to bring prostitution charges was if they had 3 or more condoms. But that was statutorily written in that as a thing that signifies you're a sex worker carrying 3 or more condoms. So people wouldn't carry them because they thought it would maybe get them in more trouble, and that obviously is not what we want.
Yeah. I guess what I kind of shake my head at when I think about this issue is just the idea, what seems to me the impossibly naive idea that you're ever going to succeed in stopping prostitution with the criminal justice system. Obviously I think this about the drug war as well. But we literally refer to it as the oldest profession.
Yeah, exactly. And you're and the big charge is they'll say end demand. We're going to end demand. And you're
right. And yeah, I just, I don't know. I'll be interested to see if this, I'll be interested to see how the right reacts to this push to criminalize Johns. I wonder, because part of me thinks that there is this double standard in the United States and in other countries that people feel kind of a sexist moral opprobrium against women who do this in a way that they don't against men.
Right.
And of course now there's this other.
There's this kind of shift, but yeah.
Yeah, and now there's this other ideological tribe that feels more appropriate.
Somebody has to be morally looked down upon in this transaction. We're not going to just let nobody.
But I wonder if, now that there's 2 tribes looking down on different people, if the effect will be to be harsher on prostitution, or if the effect will be to, maybe everyone will ease up and start to see both sides with more empathy. I don't know. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see. I also think that what I have to imagine is a trend away from street prostitution with all of the technology that allows people to connect to one another without standing on a street corner. I have to think that that's going to decrease some of the support for, the segment of support for prostitution laws that just don't want to see it on the street.
Right, exactly. You would think, so yeah, I think both the trends you just mentioned would be pointing towards more, acceptance of legalized or decriminalized prostitution.
Yeah.
Except for the fact that there's also simultaneously now and has been for a while, a huge push to sort of conflate all prostitution with sex trafficking.
Right.
So that's just sort of muddying everything up because, like you said, people are going off the streets. They're going and using these, be on Craigslist now. Backpage.com, which is a Craigslist-like site, is huge. It allows, it's become a huge venue for people to advertise. And so, of course, lawmakers from the federal level to all the states have been trying to shut it down and have been on this big campaign to shut it down because they say that it promotes sex trafficking. But the thing is, the Backpage, it's getting people off the streets where they have no time to screen clients. If you're using the internet, you can screen clients much more. You don't just need the protections of pimps, people say a lot. Allow sex workers to work on their own. So those are both good things. But aside from all that, Backpage cooperates with law enforcement. They have a massive screening system. If they see any signs that someone looks underage or of being trafficked, they report it to the National Center for Missing Children. They turn over credit card records to law enforcement and criminal penalties. So in order to catch these bad guys that they say exist, they want to shut all this down and put it back on street corners or other dispersed websites where they can't find it. So
Yeah,
just everything seems to go against what would actually help.
yeah. It does seem like there is. I don't know. My strong instinct is that there is a tension between um, helping people who are being trafficked and like it seems like in a well-regulated system of prostitution, you would be much more easily able to identify um, the number of people who are being trafficked, and that there would be, um, and I think that that the demand side might decrease for people who are being trafficked. Um, in the same way that there are
Well, right, because there's not so much a demand for trafficking victims per se, right?
right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's just, and the thing is now that if someone did suspect someone was being trafficked, a client, they're not going to go to the cops.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Get arrested, or they might, or shamed or something. But in a system where it's decriminalized, someone sees an ad on back page, goes and meets, sees something suspicious, or talks to the person, and it gets a clue, and then they can go to the cops. So.
And forgive me for being so unfamiliar with this, but is the response to that argument, no, we empirically disagree that it would be better for traffic victims? Is it doesn't matter if it's better because it's morally outrageous to allow this? Like, what's the what's the retort to a well-regulated system will be easier to catch traffickers and traffic victims?
Basically, that no one is not a trafficking victim who is in sex work. And it's a strange alliance of a certain sort of feminist and religious groups, who both push this, that no woman would ever choose, and obviously not just women are in sex work, but it's a majority of women, that no woman would choose sex work on their own, so therefore they are all victims. And even if they are not directly being forced by somebody, that false consciousness or poverty or whatever, and that we need to treat them like victims anyways. So that's the retort that you get from both feminist and religious groups, which kind of compose the main push behind this anti-trafficking effort and laws that we're seeing.
Interesting. This kind of reminds me of another story that I wanted to talk about today, and that's about a California law that concerns psychiatrists who are treating people for anything really, who come to them and reveal in some way that they have seen child pornography at some point, right? So if someone goes to their psychiatrist and is talking about, I'm addicted to painkillers, or I have a problem with alcohol, they are, the rules of confidentiality shield them from that psychiatrist revealing this to the authorities. If, on the other hand, they say, look, I have attraction toward children. I've never acted on this. But the other day, for the first time, I stumbled upon this child pornography online, and it stirred up all of these feelings, and I really want to avoid acting on this. Like, can you help me? Can you help me? Like, what do I do? Do I take medicine? Do I have behavioral therapy? I want to get better. I don't want to have this attraction. Because they admitted to having seen child pornography, the psychiatrist is compelled to report them to state authorities, or maybe local authorities. I forget which one, but report them to the police, basically. And every state has different laws about what a psychiatrist, when they're compelled to breach confidentiality. And there are some cases where it seems like it is the right thing to have them do this. For example,
right, if someone's like, I'm gonna murder someone tomorrow, or
right, or I have a kid trapped in my basement for the last 10 years. Like, you can think of cases where it would be pretty hard to defend the notion of keeping it confidential, even though and even though I acknowledge those extreme cases, at the same time there is this flip logic where it's like, well, people are only going to tell psychiatrists these things if they're assured of confidentiality. It's not as if these cases where they reveal something it's not as if these things are going to keep happening anyway if there's no confidentiality. So it seems to me that even though there are these extreme cases where, yes, you ought to report these things where there's imminent danger of someone being, egregiously harmed. In the case of child pornography, what these psychiatrists are arguing is that is that basically it's not helping anyone to report this to authorities. Uh, in part because of the nature of child pornography. Um, in other words, someone tells this to you in a in the setting of their psychiatrist's office, and then you go to police and they take a report, and then a week later someone gets around to coming and following up on it, and it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to go and find the same piece of child pornography and then track it back to a child who is still, being compelled to produce it. Much of this is produced um, internationally, apparently, and it's very hard to track back. And like, if it could be tracked back, it's ostensibly online and accessible to people seeking it out anyway. And so why couldn't authorities just go and find it on their own and track it back if it could be tracked back by just identifying pictures, right? So there are all these reasons to think that it's not actually going to help the kid.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's reason to think that it is definitely going to have a chilling effect on people going and telling caregivers about this. And isn't that, they would argue, and I would argue, exactly what you want to happen? So of this very small subset of people who are seeking out child pornography, there's another even smaller subset that is going and seeking help. And isn't that exactly what we want to happen? Don't we want to encourage as many people as possible who have this affliction to go and seek this kind of help, and to seek it before they act on it, and to hopefully, I think child pornography is one of the very few kinds of speech that I'm totally okay with being illegal, and I think it's right that it is illegal. But it just seems obvious to me that you want to create a path for people with this affliction to be able to go and seek help without the guarantee that they're going to be, jailed and labeled sex offenders and have their life destroyed. It's just such an obvious disincentive to the thing we want them, I think, to do.
Yeah, I mean, what did you say that their rationale even is? I mean, I guess I don't know that they're going to save children somehow by this, but
the other rationale is that the other rationale is that they're going after the demand side of the child pornography business. If they don't know about people downloading this, they're unable to pursue and prosecute them, and if they're unable to pursue and prosecute them, there will continue to exist a demand for it, and that demand will continue to drive people to produce it and victimize kids. So it's kind of like the whole
demand thing again. Like, obviously I'm against child pornography, against people making it and viewing it and everything, but the idea that you can end demand for it by like law enforcement individually going around and finding every single person who has ever viewed it is just so absurd to me.
Right. And I mean,
I was gonna say that we were talking about earlier with the strategy to end demand for prostitution. It's really funny because I was looking at the beginning of sort of the war on drugs in the late 80s, and I found a lot of people back then talking about how what we really needed to do to really get this drug thing once and for all was to end demand for drugs. And Ronald Reagan gave a speech where he's like, in fact, we already are ending demand and it's already showing results, and we know how that worked out. So
yeah. And I don't even know actually like yeah, I don't really even know how the demand side ostensibly works. And like, I've been curious about this for a long time because I remember in the Inland Empire when I was a reporter there, they were doing one of these like stings where, like the To Catch a Predator style stings. And I ended up interviewing, just like informally, I don't even ever think I wrote about, but I interviewed one of the people who was like involved in the sting. And we were talking about the whole problem of trafficking and child pornography and pedophiles. And like, I remember asking, like, how does it even work? Like, how does the demand side work? Is is it ads? I assume it's not ad supported, but then is it people directly paying? And like, but like apparently some people just like find it and download it online. I don't. And this person who, worked pretty intimately in it seemed they had never even considered actually how the demand side worked. But like, I don't really get how it works. And I wonder, like, I'm trying to imagine a way in which it would make sense to even put a dent on the demand side to go after individual
Right.
users. And I suppose if someone was like directly funding, you know, like doing the equivalent of Kickstarter, right? Like funneling people money to fund their continued
Right.
production, right? Then I think, yeah, the demand side totally matters then. And, you know, of course, I have no problem going after those people. And if, you know, I suppose if they want to have an exception, if you tell your psychiatrist, yeah, I'm funding like child pornography movies in another country, you know, with my
Right.
poker winnings or whatever, like, then yeah, okay.
But and that would already be a crime under California law, though, right? Because didn't you say that it is? I mean, obviously it'd be a crime. Didn't you say that psychiatrists do have to report if someone says that they're making or like producing child porn?
Yeah, I think so. But in any case, yeah, I mean, like the distinction I want to draw is, and I think that the psychiatrists want to draw as well in the lawsuit they filed, is basically, you know, not people who are producing it, not people who are paying a bunch of money to have it produced on their behalf, but you know, people who are, I suppose,
Trying to get help,
consumers of it who reveal, or actually, and it's not just. It's not actually just, you know, all of the people I've been talking about are, you know, relatively unsympathetic
teens.
even
yes,
to me.
There's the teen part, which is the worst part of it, I think, right? The teen sexting?
Yeah, so this includes, you know, child pornography technically includes a 16-year-old kid sending his girlfriend explicit images or receiving them from his girlfriend. You know, within a high school, these images go around and then everybody has quote unquote child pornography on their phones. And all of them can be charged as sex offenders. And so a 16-year-old kid goes into the psychiatrist, you know, how is school today? Well, you know, I was a little bit bothered because a friend of mine, you know, he seems to be getting into drinking and now he sent his girlfriend this explicit image and I'm worried that he's going to get in trouble. And, you know, I saw it and it's like not that bad, but it's definitely like him, you know, doing this sexually explicit thing. A kid who says that suddenly has their psychiatrist reporting them to the state authorities, and they are possibly in serious trouble with the law. So there's that whole side of it too. It's not just these cases that are unsympathetic on many levels, even to me, but it's also these cases where it shouldn't be child pornography at all. And this is, in some sense, a problem with the underlying law and not this reporting law. Like if you fix that, the problem would go away, and this part of the problem would go away. But yeah, but again, it's like the sex worker industry in this sense that it's frustrating because, you know, I fully share this desire to eliminate victims of child trafficking and child pornography, and I feel like the people who are most loudly moralistic on this issue, ostensibly on the same side, are working at cross purposes because they're like more worried about signaling opprobrium and outrage than they are about whatever it is that's actually going to reduce the problem and help people. And I just don't like. I just want to. All these supply and demand side arguments, I just want to be like, have a better understanding of economics, like have a and like human incentives and like all the experience we have about.
Well, and like so just. One of the things, one more story that I've come across is there was a big report that came out last year. They looked at end demand stings and they were saying that they were aiming to end child sex trafficking. So they had these end demand stings where police posed as an adult sex worker on Backpage. And then when someone emailed them and agreed to meet to have sex, then they would say, oh, I'm actually only 17 or I'm actually only 16.
Yeah.
And then when the person came anyways, they arrested them as a sex trafficker. And the thing is, it said something like 40 to 60% of the anti-trafficking stings that these federally funded task forces in different cities were doing were going towards doing this.
Yeah.
So that's so much time and money spent not actually catching people. Like there was no, and the report, and this was by an anti-trafficking group, one of the ones who is in favor of this plan, and they even said that these men were not pedophiles and were not necessarily looking for anyone younger. They just sort of went along with it. Maybe that's not like the best ethical thing to do. It's not the most moral thing to do, but it's a world different than being someone who is seeking to pay for sex with a child, to agree to have sex with a 17-year-old. And
yeah, and the cases that bother,
it's just equating these are not helping anybody.
Yeah, and like in a very qualified small defense of this tactic, you could even imagine, if you wanted to be really charitable to the law enforcement side of this, that maybe openly advertising on Backpage for, like, if you were underage, would immediately get caught. So people start using like code words, and then you email,
Right.
and they're like, "Oh, I'm actually 17," right? You can imagine this kind of two-step dance. But the cases I saw that you're talking about weren't that. Like, it wasn't just, okay, we went through the little code. They were persuaded, like, they were kind of like in extended conversations. There would even be people who would be like, "Oh, I'm not, really comfortable. I'm not looking for that." And then they'd email back, and they would like use like the emotional intimacy created from an extended conversation to persuade these people.
They definitely do that.
And yeah, those are the cases that I just found so awful. Like I just can't imagine being one of these law enforcement officers, like an adult with the emotional maturity of adult. And I think that adult's emotional maturity is probably even coming through somewhat in their conversations with these people, and the
which is what
intimacy
some of the
that
people
they're
have
creating.
even said, that they didn't sound. One of the persons who challenged it, I think that was one of these type of cases, said there was like, they didn't sound like a teenager. I didn't think they were. I just thought that they were saying they were under 18 because they thought that it would be like hot, like it was like a marketing thing. Which,
Right.
I mean, who knows, obviously, but
Yeah. Well, and,
I think,
and there's also all of these. Yeah, I'm trying to think of whose blog it was that had sex worker interviews that I was reading, like, over an extended period of time a few years ago. But you would read cases about like about the surprising number of Johns who would hire someone and then not have sex with them. They were like,
oh yeah,
they were like there for the emotional intimacy, right? And
right.
and obviously, it's like, on one hand, this is like an implausible defense in any case, in any given case. If someone is like going to meet a kid and, "Oh, I was just going to
Right.
cuddle," it's like, you can't. I'm not saying that should be a defense that should get people off of these charges. At the same time, you have to imagine, when you're actively trying to coerce people into doing this by creating an emotional connection, that you're getting some number of those people, right? And like,
Right.
you just need to be, it's just, again, like the amount of resources, right, to capture one of these people with an extended conversation. It takes a lot of manpower, right? At least it will, until we have the like robot text that passes the Turing test well enough to, like, God,
Robot undercover cops.
I just saw a terrifying future where
I know.
where there's robot undercover cops who are doing this all the time. But yeah, this takes a lot of manpower, and you can't, like, again, are these, if there really is child trafficking going on, like,
you mentioned earlier. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, is there really nowhere else that you can better use these resources to protect children who are in? Go ahead.
No, just, you had said that the sort of moral outrage of people was driving this, but I think you get a lot of it too. I mean, I'm cynical, but reading about this all the time, I can't help but not be, that it's just politicians and police and prosecutors who find these kinds of cases way easier to get to do than actually, like the hard work, or the maybe not as prevalent work. Maybe you can't. There are not 60 sex traffickers to catch if you don't define all sex workers as sex traffickers. So they don't get to have that public, saying they're doing this good thing. They don't get to say they've been using all these federal funds to catch all these people. But if they just define it this way, then they can. So I think that there's just a lot of incentives for police to go after this sort of thing, that instead of, what would be more helpful to actual victims.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's move on to our last topic. And that is the internet and journalism. We've both been in this profession for a pretty good chunk of time now, and a chunk of time that maybe in the past there wouldn't have been that much change over the course. I started my first journalism job in 2002 professionally. Once I was out of college, I did some college journalism too, but was
2005 for me.
Yeah, so I was a newspaper reporter in 2002, and you started in 2005, and it's been pretty rapidly a rapidly changing environment, a rapidly changing business environment, a rapidly changing editorial environment too. It's interesting to look back. I think to when I was first starting journalism, in the newspaper that I was at was sort of like, oh well, there seem to be these blog things, and at first everyone was very antagonistic toward them, and there was this big divide between bloggers and the MSM, and over time, newspapers like the small newspaper that I was at, the Inland Valley Daily Bulletin, and the chain that it was a part of, the Los Angeles Newspaper Group, started experimenting with blogs, and and of course this happened at the national level too. And now the uh, the avant-garde at that time, if you want to call it that, is the establishment now. And
Yeah.
some of the earliest bloggers have gone on to start, institute like Ezra Klein has started Vox, and and you just see the kind of wholesale integration of these different models of journalism into a journalistic landscape now that I understand less and less. Back when it was this divide between bloggers and the establishment press, or the old school press, or whatever you want to call it, the traditional press, um, I felt like I was reading people who were kind of at the cutting edge of thinking about this divide and the way that journalism was evolving. And going back, and to pick one person, going back and reading Jay Rosen in those days and all of the blog posts that he wrote that I think still hold up as being relatively prescient. And there's still lots of smart people thinking about the media today, but it's segmented in a way that it used to be that if I would talk to peers in journalism, we would be reading a lot of the same articles in a lot of the same places. Now I'm in the position I do this newsletter every week, and a year-end list every year of best journalism that I have come across in the past year. And I'm kind of amazed, like now when I talk to even friends who share generally my taste in what good journalism is, we're reading different things and different people, and we're all over the place, and like all these new places are popping up. I've seen like Fusion's hired all of these great writers who I'd never encountered before, and then I started following Fusion because my former colleague Alexis Madrigal went there and is an editor there, and then Kashmir Hill, who I also follow, went there, and then I discovered all these other people who were doing great work, right, that had been doing it all along and that I'd never seen. And I guess the more I watch things unfold, the less I think I understand where journalism is, where it's going. What are your impressions, kind of reflecting on this time that you've been doing it?
Well, like last week or something, someone was trying to dismiss one of my articles, and they commented. It was just like a rando on Twitter, and they commented like, it's just on a blog. Anyways, what does she know? And it just made me laugh because I was like, oh man, I haven't heard that in so long.
Yeah.
On Reason's website, I mean, we have a print magazine and we have some feature articles, but pretty much everything else goes on our blog, and there's very little difference between anything that's on our blog and any other kind of content. It's the case, I think, most outlets now. I mean, or more or less. I think it's interesting how that's changed blogging. Because if you look back at headlines from blog, like even on the Reason site, as professional bloggers, but the headlines were all like jokes or inside jokes or references to obscure things or not at all SEO friendly. And people wrote blog posts like much more conversationally and much more sort of like an ongoing conversation. Whereas I feel like now, I don't know of many blogs that still exist, professional blogs that still exist where that is like a style. I mean, it's much more like every blog post is a mini article into itself.
Yeah, and I think that's driven by Facebook. I think
Right.
I think like a quick history of the way it's unfolded to this point is that
it's driven by where people are coming from.
Yeah.
A lot. Like the form of the
Yeah, you had the days when people would read a blogger and they would go back every day to that blogger, and it was this ongoing conversation. And I think working with Andrew Sullivan, who was one of the pioneers of this and one of the most successful at it. You would see people come back and there would be these inside joke headlines. There would be these continuing series on the same subject, and you kind of had to follow along. And in the earliest days before RSS, you would even like go to a blog and then scroll all the way down to like the last post that you didn't read and then start scrolling up again.
Yeah.
And working your way back, right? and you would be like going to all of these
Oh
different
my
sites.
God, we're gonna be we sound like such old people. We're like, I remember when you scrolled down the
Yeah.
blogs, you guys.
No, it's totally true, and I think people coming up now couldn't even conceive of the way that we read then. And then
Yeah.
Google started,
Even RSS readers seem weird to people now that are
yeah, and I
a
still
few years
use
younger than us.
I still use RSS and love RSS. It's my preferred model
Do
of
you?
consumption.
I just found out that one of my coworkers still visits individual pages of sites. I thought that was crazy.
Yeah, I bought into Feedly Pro at the beginning, but so then you had this era when like bloggers figured out, Google is going to drive traffic to us if we have these certain kind of headlines, and I think Huffington Post at a certain time was the master of the SEO headline, right, to optimize for Google searches, and then this unexpected thing happened, and suddenly Google searches didn't matter anymore because people were reading what their network shared on Facebook and Twitter, and especially Facebook, way more than anything else. And so this is the whole Upworthy style of headlines optimized to share, and BuzzFeed is probably the place that has done it the best as a model over a sustained time. And so I wonder how long this sharing model is going to last. Are we going to settle into a new future where this is kind of where we're at, that like people are sharing through their Facebook and their LinkedIn and their maybe some other social network that follows up Facebook? I don't know. Or is it going to be another paradigm shift?
Did you see there was Ezra Klein had something on Vox recently about how in the near future, publications are going to function a lot more like wire services, and in fact already kind of are, like how AP, it just like sends out its stories to all the different newspapers, more or less like Reason Magazine is a wire service, Atlantic is a wire service that sends out its stories to Facebook and Twitter. It's not a perfect analogy, but I thought that was interesting.
I do too, yeah. And I don't know if that's right. I mean,
I don't know if it is either. It's just
and like
it's less scary.
It's like Ezra is certainly as informed an observer about this kind of stuff as anyone, and that's a plausible future. I think there are a lot of other plausible futures, and there's this big looming question that isn't just looming in the future of journalism, but in the internet generally, and that is, a really simplified version of it is how much control is Facebook going to have? Are we seeing,
Hey, it's kind of terrifying. It's very terrifying how much control Facebook has, kind of.
Well, I just wonder if it's like, people of our generation have been through this time when MySpace came and went, and we remember Friendster, and we remember when AOL was this huge company, and when Yahoo was this behemoth company, and we've seen all of these rises and falls. And so is Facebook really going to be the one that lasts forever, or is something else going to come along? Are people going to get tired of it? It's not as obvious to me. It's not obvious to me, and I think this is part of what I mean when I say I don't understand the journalistic landscape anymore. Like, on one hand, it's great to be able to build up some number of followers that likes my writing and can follow me on Facebook and can follow me on Twitter, and that seeks out my articles on The Atlantic. These are different people that seek it out in different ways, and they can continue to do it in all these ways. And I guess my preference is that there continue to be all these kinds of streams. And podcasting is getting huge. I wonder how that's gonna change things.
Is podcast still getting huge?
Oh, I think so.
This is not an area I know anything about. My sense is that like it's on the decline. Interesting.
Well, so yeah, this is a perfect example. Like you and I follow a lot of the same publications, read a lot of the same journalists, and we've known each other for years, and yet we see something as basic as our perception of this completely differently, apparently. And this is my experience of having these conversations with people, and it's so interesting to me. So I guess we'll see. Maybe we should each throw out a prediction that we can return to in the future. We can go back in the Blogging Heads archives 5 or 10 years from now and see if we're correct. Do you have any prediction that you want to make?
Holograms. More holograms. No.
There will be a version of you and
I
I
don't.
that passed the Turing test that is doing a blogging head by a hologram.
Exactly.
It's just like
Plugging had holograms and Turing test cops.
that'd be amazing if.
I wonder. Well, I'm excited about this. Is the first like Snapchat election. Remember when everyone was saying it was like the first Instagram election last time? Or now there's been a bunch of Snapchat campaign ads, which I think is going to be interesting to watch. And everyone is saying that outlets are going, like, magazines are going to have to get more into Snapchat and Vine, and I don't know about that, but.
Well, I'm gonna throw out something that I want to happen. As someone who hates the process of like getting dressed up and going in a car to a TV studio where you sit in a room for a long time and like waste a lot of your time, and then like finally you go on TV and then you like spend a couple minutes saying something that's much less substantive than what you wrote. You can tell that I hate this process, and then you have to go home in traffic and you're like, oh man, I could have written all these things. So what I want is just a computer program that goes in and analyzes my writing, and then it can generate a hologram of me that can go on TV and articulate my positions faithfully. But like, I don't actually have to be there. Like, it'll just have like a pretty good enough version of me that I like, I can disavow it if it gets something wrong. But it can just go on and like have the conversation, and that's my ideal future.
I'm hoping for that too.
All right.
I do feel like, I'll say what I was saying. I think we are lucky that we came up in the journalism era we did, because we have been moving with these changes more quickly than a lot of previous generations of journalists have. So that's like my one hope. Peter Suderman has said this, who works here at Reason with me. I don't know, I'm saying this for who? For people listening to Blogging Heads, I guess, because you know that, obviously. He thinks that we might be better able to adapt to whatever journalistic landscape changes come than our sort of generational predecessors, because we can adapt to the speed of technology quicker because we've been doing it. But that might just be wishful thinking. All the 26-year-olds and robots take our jobs.
Well, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that we have come up in a mindset where we not only leveraged a changing environment to start our careers in journalism, but I think that there's a platform agnosticism that is helpful to have.
Yeah.
And I appreciate just about every media format that's out there. I love I love listening to podcasts. I love looking at photo essays. I love everything from I basically love everything except cable news. So if the future is all going on cable news,
but then where will your hologram go if there's no cable news?
In that future, I'll just change professions, but otherwise, I'll just enjoy reaching people with ideas that I think are important, where they're at, and
in whatever medium.
And I think it's kind of fun to learn new mediums, and to I'd like to start a podcast at some point. I'd like to.
I'm going to join Snapchat soon.
All right. Maybe you can pioneer the Snapchat election of the future. And we should close because, I've got podcasting to learn and you've got Snapchatting to learn, I guess.
Well, thank you for having me on, Connor. This was fun.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Bye.